Hi, y'all. Today, I want to talk about the topic of language. We know that the deaf community is truly diverse in what type of language works for each individual. It has always been my goal and passion for all of them to have full access to a language, any language. Which one is beside the point, honestly? For example, if a deaf person grew up using spoken English and they got by well because their English literacy skills and interaction with others were adequate, that's great. Good for them. One of my best friends that I grew up with, Mike Taman, used the oral method of communication. We were quite different, but I could also speak, so when we interacted, we used spoken English. Later on, I met Carrie Brooks in the fourth grade. We both used sign and spoken English to communicate with each other, going back and forth between the two. And that worked for us. Later on, I would meet others. Um, what were their names? Oh, yes, the Cassesi family, who were all deaf and used no spoken English. I got along with them just fine. I could interact with the whole spectrum of deaf communicators. The key was that they all had fluent language. I first met deaf people who did not have fluent language or experienced extreme language deprivation at the Model Secondary School for the Deaf in DC. The realization was painful. It was heart-wrenching to see so many students who experienced this. I thought back to my deaf school experience in Maine and realized I wasn't aware of language deprivation there because the students could all sign fluently, though they may have had no English skills. At MSSD in DC, I met those who struggled with communicating in English and ASL. They didn't yet have a first language because they hadn't had full access to either. Luckily at MSSD, they could spend their last few years of high school acquiring as much language as possible, but the setback was severe. Let me explain more about why I'm bringing this up in the first place. There's an unwritten public policy out there. It's not a written rule, but it's actively being used by so many professionals to decide the course that hard of hearing and deaf babies' lives will take. This policy is referred to as parents' choice. It includes parents making decisions about what language the baby will ultimately use, whether English or American Sign Language. Unfortunately, these decisions are made without any knowledge of what the baby will grow up to be like. Is parents' choice really the right terminology to use for this policy? Of course, parents have the right to make decisions for the well-being of their baby. But if you look around the world, you'll see that the majority of parents are already acquainted with a life similar to the one that their child will experience. This is called horizontal experience because parent and child are alike. When parents have a baby that does not share their experience in the way that is typical, as in the case of a deaf child and a parent who identifies with and is immersed in a hearing world, it's not possible for them to pass down that identity to the child. They can't share language with the child in the way they expect to and are at a loss for what to do. In this way, parents' choice is not even a choice. It's an illusion, not grounded in reality. In the last few years, Lead K and language acquisitions rights advocates have started a movement to protect the right to acquire any language that's a natural fit for a child's brain. I say this repeatedly, the brain is a crucial missing element in audiology assessments. When they measure hearing via the ears, it doesn't actually tell you about what the brain can do. There's a phenomenon where a fully hearing person's brain cannot process the sound it hears. The opposite can be true as well. The ears could hear very little, but the brain will utilize and discern every bit of sound it receives. So, how does parents' choice really work? It doesn't compute. What are they actually choosing? As an alternative, I now present to you the idea of educated or informed choice. Educated choice means once parents are given all relevant information, then they truly have a choice. With a baby, informed choice means offering everything available to the child. If I had a deaf baby, I would sign to them, speak to them, do cued speech with them, give them all of it. Why would you choose only one? Bilingualism is incredible. Why not give them both? Most deaf parents do give both ASL and English. Yet, hearing parents are asked to pick one. That's what parents' choice amounts to. So I encourage you, instead, please consider making an informed choice. This will allow the child to demonstrate what language they thrive with as parents take note of what works best, following the child's lead. Now I want to explain another layer of concern that I have here. Hmm. Many hearing people will struggle to understand this. I'll share a personal story about my family. When my mother passed away, I was in New York City and I was pregnant. My friends chipped in to buy me a ticket to fly home instead of taking the bus. The moment I arrived, I went to a family meeting at the funeral home to make plans for my mother's funeral, open or closed casket, public or private, that kind of thing. In this meeting for planning my mom's funeral, there was my maternal grandfather, my mom's sister, and myself. By that point, we had been having several meetings in regards to my mom during the last month of her life. All of those meetings happened without interpreters. During one meeting with a doctor, we were getting the prognosis for my mother's life expectancy. So I was sitting right next to the doctor so I could see him speaking clearly as possible, while my aunt and grandpa sat on the other side of me. Eyes bouncing back and forth to follow the conversation, I made sure I understood everything by asking for clarification along the way. And I managed fine. To give you some context, my grandfather had a pretty specific idea of who I was. He didn't really know the whole Regan. He didn't know who I was as a deaf person. He only knew me as the English-speaking Regan, never the signing Regan. So keep that in mind as I continue the story. So 1 month later, when we were in the funeral home, we agreed to a public open casket funeral. And that's when I made the request for an interpreter. My grandfather was perplexed. He didn't think I needed one. I disagreed and I tried to explain that I wouldn't understand what was being said otherwise. He pushed back, believing I was fine without one all this time. I explained that it's different when there's a large group of people who communicate and move their mouths differently. It's not the same as interacting with family. What I do in the context of communicating with family is entirely situational. For my mother's funeral, I absolutely needed an interpreter. After a long time of trying to hash it out with Grampy, my aunt asked if I could just let it go because my grandfather was getting upset. I was like, "Excuse me? This is my mother's funeral." My mother's funeral. he was making me upset. But that's when I realized the bigger picture, what was really going on. He didn't realize that my ability to speak and lip read is very limited, applicable in only a few situations, not everywhere and anywhere. I finally won the battle by saying that I would pay for it. Of course, I was disappointed. I was 27. Yes, 27. He really should have known. I mean, he was my biggest advocate for education. He went to all of my IEP meetings and made sure I got what I needed for equal education access. Yet for the funeral, he didn't get it. Here's my point, and the moral of this story. Yes, there are more and more laws being passed for language acquisition rights all throughout the US, and this is great. My concern is with audiologists and oral education advocates not understanding that spoken language is a one-way street. It's one way. It's not an equal exchange, and therein lies its limits. So, as far as informed choice goes, and parents choosing language for use at school based on what's working at home, I am deeply concerned. It is my worst fear. Shit. The realization just hit me square in the face. I'm working with Lead K in Maine, and I was dissenting on something, and it finally hit me why they didn't get it. It didn't occur to me before. Back to the parents' choice concept. Parents are assuming that if their child can survive with spoken English at home, where they have an established system that works for them in a small group of people, then it means it'll work just as well at school. That couldn't be farther from the truth. There's a big difference between a close-knit group of people at home versus a room full of students and teachers. At school, there are more distractions and barriers to spoken communication. I can't tell you how many times I had to tell my teacher to look at me because I couldn't see what they were saying. They would forget over and over again while going through their materials, moving around the classroom. It was awful. I missed so much as a lip reader. It was a huge struggle, and that's why my grades were so awful. People couldn't figure out the problem because I functioned so well using spoken English in one-on-one situations. Almost perfectly if they had the right lips, you know? If they were one lipper, forget it. But if they moved both lips and had facial expression, then it was doable. So that impacted my schooling. They made decisions for me based on what worked at home rather than considering the context, the people, the setting, and a lack of eye contact. It's really unfortunate. So people tend to ask me about this a lot. I didn't have a language until around 4.5 years old when they started to figure things out. I was born and raised in Maine, so all this happened here in Maine. My mom was in denial about my deafness, but my dad was aware, so they had opposing views. I lived with my dad full time, starting when I was about 4 or 4.5, and had visitations with my mom and Grampy. After I was diagnosed as deaf, they had to figure out how to communicate with me. They tried speaking, signing, cued speech. Oh, wait, no, yeah, cued speech, and then finally total communication, which worked. By the time I started to pick up language and use it expressively, I was 6. So, yeah, my language acquisition was delayed. But they did test different languages and modalities with me to see what would work. And that's really important to me. That works better than picking one language and using it at home and school regardless of the results. That kind of thinking is unrealistic. At 6 years old, I went into Baxter School for the Deaf, and I would constantly speak but didn't sign. No one actually taught me to sign. I would see people sign and speak, and I would speak back to them. I didn't realize that I could sign too. I had ADHD, and back then, there was no understanding of what that looked like in a deaf child. They thought the solution was to take me out of the deaf school and put me into a public school. I was in kindergarten, and I was constantly speaking but missing everything going on around me. I didn't understand anything that happened in school until about the fourth grade. This changed thanks to Carrie Brooks. She befriended me and she invited me over to her house after school and essentially homeschooled me, reteaching me everything. Honestly, before Carrie, I was totally ignorant. I didn't know anything. Not for lack of IQ or intelligence. It was all because I didn't have access. I was language deprived. I had no access to information and academic content. None. I was scraping by. They had already decided I was a failure as a deaf student. You see, I failed in a signing environment, and then I was failing at spoken English. They decided that spoken English was the only way to keep going. My dad did his best trying to figure it all out. After the deaf school pushed me out, the only deaf school, it seemed the only option I had left was to be mainstreamed into public school. So, in the sixth grade, Carrie started sleeping at Baxter dorms on Wednesday nights and would play sports. I joined her, and it really helped. I was learning ASL from deaf teachers then. I was learning to sign and realizing that I'm supposed to sign back. I didn't realize this until Carrie taught me in the fourth grade. Remember, growing up, my deaf best friend, Mike Taman, used spoken English, so I thought that was the only way. I did go to Baxter for annual assessments and IQ testing, and I always envied the deaf kids there. They seemed nothing like me. They were so happy, and I was so sad. I felt like a broken deaf person and a broken hearing person. I didn't belong anywhere. I remember crying when I was 10 or 11, trying to figure out why I was broken and didn't fit anywhere. Carrie arrived in the nick of time and really helped. She spoke English and ASL and taught me to sign. I could finally have a normal conversation with another person. I was totally spellbound. Up until then, I had terrible grades. I had no idea what was going on in school. I would be constantly missing everything and trying to keep up, barely getting by. I copied whatever was on the board and was constantly lost about what I was supposed to do. Then I finally had a class where I was accessing information more than ever. I was understanding it all. An emergency IEP meeting was called, and the team asked me how I finally got a good grade only for this one class. I simply said, "Oh, there's an interpreter in that class." It was Carrie's interpreter. We had a schedule with rotating classes, and one of our classes happened to be together. The team was dumbfounded. They never imagined I would need an interpreter. I said, "Yeah, I think I do need an interpreter because the teachers and students are never making eye contact with me when they're speaking. The interpreter stands in place and delivers the information in sign." Overnight, they changed my schedule to follow Carrie's so I could use her interpreter for access. That's how I got my first B, the first time. The impressions that everyone had of me were all wrong. I failed at the deaf school, but really, no one taught me to get my hands in the air and sign. They thought because I did so well using spoken English at home, it should work for school. But when it didn't work well, they assumed it was simply because I was not smart. They misjudged and made assumptions because they were all hearing. They were totally clueless without my lived experience. So for high school, I went to MSSD. I didn't need an interpreter because all of the teachers signed. That was neat, but wow, a lot of things I saw really pained me. To see so much language deprivation, it had happened to me too. I was reliving it vicariously through them. I think this is what feeds my passion. I was that kid. I was that language deprived person. I thought Boston was a state. I was so confused. I didn't know that there were states in the US in the 6th grade. I had no idea where my geographic location was. I knew I lived in Maine, but I didn't understand what Maine was. I had no anchors for all the partial information I was getting. Nothing. Nothing. So 3 years later, when I went to MSSD, I saw my experience reflected back to me. My heart broke. I was the same way until I finally got to access everything. In my middle school years, the IEP team said that I wouldn't be able to go to college. 7th, 8th grade, they said, nope, Regan's going on to vocational track. She can't do college. I have a PhD, motherfuckers. It was because I was surrounded entirely by hearing people. Are you getting where I'm going with this? So yes, I can speak English in a one-on-one situation scraping by. I prefer not to though. I worry that I'll miss something that they say to me. Before, I didn't care if I monopolized a whole conversation because then at least I had control of the situation. That was my coping strategy. If they would talk less and I would know what the conversation was about. If someone's talking a lot, I actually feel bad for all the work they're putting in. I feel kind of embarrassed. When I'm signing, I never, ever feel that bad. I never feel that bad for another person. I don't feel my energy getting depleted, and I especially never feel embarrassed. Even if you don't know sign, I don't feel embarrassed. I'm happy to be supportive and willing to work with you. So back to informed choice. It's ideal because you allow the child to show you what works best for them. That means you have to watch them at home and watch them in other situations in bigger groups. Listening and speaking doesn't work well in big groups. It really doesn't for people like me. I'm deaf up to 90 decibels. I am very deaf. I can speak well enough for people in Maine, but in other states, they often can't understand me because of my combined deaf and Maine accents. Here in Maine, people understand me relatively well. But this doesn't help me in a classroom, doesn't help me in big groups. It doesn't. With ASL, I have more access. Those who are hard of hearing, who can hear voices from behind them without lip reading, can use spoken English. They have access, and I have no issues with that, as long as it doesn't cause language deprivation. And that's the crux of my argument. Oppression is occurring when parents insist on using spoken English. Congratulations, your child can say 20 words. Is that a life skill that's going to get them through work and education? 20 words? Really? Are parents that stubborn? I don't think that's the case. I think parents really want to bring out the best in their child who they love and care for. What these parents don't have is informed choice. They aren't aware of what can happen. They assume that what they see working at home is working in every situation. Like my grampy. He thought I would be fine at a funeral without an interpreter. Definitely not. Do I blame him? No. It didn't occur to him, and it didn't occur to me either. And then it hit me in the midst of all this Lead K and language acquisition stuff. Making decisions based on assessments in the home is unacceptable. They have to consider the setting is vastly different in school. Look, this is so simple, really simple. You know how adolescent development works? You have babies who then move on to parallel play as toddlers, right? Words aren't actually important for socialization at this stage. there isn't much conversation really happening yet. All the way up until around 8 years old, they seem fine. Because up until that age, advanced conversation skills are not critical for social interaction yet. But at 9 or 10 years old, these skills become crucial. This is when they become self conscious and start singling others out. You can't assume that language decisions you make before that stage of development will work forever. Parallel play requires different skills than interactive play. You see what I mean? It's vital to consider that. I'm concerned that audiologists do not pay attention to that. Many of them believe that if a child wears hearing aids all day, every day, then their hearing will improve. No, honey. I'm deaf up to 90 decibels, and nothing is going to change that. More hearing aid time isn't what helps me. It's my brain that does the work. I would compare it to a photographic memory. It's difficult to explain, but I hear these patterns of sounds, and my brain uses recall to fill in the gaps. It's like when hearing people are having a conversation and someone doesn't understand what was just said. As they ask for clarification, their brain does an instant replay before the other person even gets a chance to repeat themselves. They end up piecing it together on their own without the need for any answers. That's something like what my brain does. So how do you know if your deaf baby has that skill or not? An audiogram is only a small puzzle piece. It says nothing about your child's brain. It's not the full picture. So how do you piece it all together? Time. Yes, it could take 1, 2, 3 years, and time is precious. So give them everything. It hurts no one. There's no downfall in giving the child as much access as possible. Absolutely none. This is my passion, access to language. So here's a situation that's a little off topic. When we, well, I have to be careful about how I say things here. Never mind. The question is, when hearing parents have a deaf baby, what relevant lived experience do they have regarding communication access for a deaf brain? Very little. The same goes for doctors and professionals out there who study us as if we are their specimens. We're not. We're actual people, and we can speak for ourselves. We have something to contribute to this conversation. I wanted to share about the deaf brain and how we adapt to different situations with the visual input that we've got. Deaf people are an extremely diverse group. Most have a wide range of options for communication to navigate a wide range of situations. But those with limited options can navigate very few situations. So which is better for your child? More. All. Give them everything you can. I brought this face mask to illustrate. Spoken English is not going to be an option now. I can write back and forth. I had been using my voice to text app that was working perfectly. I'd hold it up to other people to let them speak into it. But lately, with masks, that strategy is not successful anymore. So now I'm back to paper and pen. I don't even bother trying to speak with my mask on because I already have to contend with my deaf accent and my Maine accent. So wearing a mask takes that option off the table. I can sign and I can write notes. I often find myself in positions where I don't understand spoken English. That happens, but it happens much less with sign language. I'm glad I have access to both languages. I'm glad Carrie came into my life when she did and took the time and the effort to teach me after school. In the sixth grade, I finally started accessing more content and had more curiosity. I finally cared about my grades because I came to understand what they represented. I've really spoken at length here, but what matters is that you understand what I'm getting at. I strongly encourage parents to consider informed choice. Don't make decisions today and expect it to work for the rest of their lives. Consider each situation case by case and adapt as you go. My love to you all.